Hi, this is Mike Corey. I want to thank everybody today for joining us at Database Licensing Best Practices and Pitfalls. We're going to try to have a little bit of fun along the way, and we will try to leave a few minutes for questions at the end.
And I'm Don Sullivan. I work with Mike, have for a very, very long time. I am the product line marketing manager for business critical applications with the cloud services platform unit at VMware. In that role, I've spent a lot of time, over about 30 years, with Oracle. And so Mike and I will hopefully both inform you and entertain you for the next 45 minutes.
And this is a quick slide about myself. I've been working Oracle at this point for 36 years. I started with version 3. I've made my living in the database space. I've published a few books along the way. I am an Oracle ace today. I was a past Microsoft MVP. And also, like Don, who's also, I believe, an Oracle ace, I'm also a VMware V expert. And we're going to move a little quickly just because I tend to like slides. Dawn, what was the slide count? Do you remember?
It's only 45 this time, Mike.
Oh,
not
then
about
I can...
150, so I think we're going to be able to do this easily.
Okay, I'll slow down then. Yeah. So I am going to do things with Dawn's help from an Oracle perspective, and we're really going to talk about software licensing in general. So everything we're saying here goes well beyond database licensing. It all applies to software licensing in the industry. And so the lessons learned here, you should be able to put to good use. This is my sales pitch. I am from a company called License Fortress, and we focus on Oracle license compliancy, and we offer the industry's only financial and legal guarantee around our license advice. And I'll keep the sales pitch down to that.
And for full disclosure, License Fortress has been kind enough to ask me to be on their advisory board. So not only am I with VMware, I am with License Fortress as well.
Well, the reason we ask you, Don, is because in New England, we consider you wicked smart.
Oh, well, I'm a New York, New Jerseyer, so that's a big compliment. You will see us go banter back and forth with Yankee Red Sox stuff. That's just innate in the way we think. So
I know you're a Yankee fan. I can't take it out of you, unfortunately. You were born that way. That's how I was.
Literally, I was.
So I think it's really interesting to understand licensing from a concept of the world of patent trolls. And so patent trolls was really a derogatory term used to identify companies that use patent infringement claims to win court judgments for profit or stifle the competition. So these companies really didn't produce anything, but really just tried to collect licensing fees or settlements for companies that overstepped their infringement. And in fact, at one point, Intel called these patent trolls a derogatory term and got taken to court over it. And so this lawyer at Intel, Peter Denkin, actually coined the term as a way to comment on these patent trolls without creating a legal problem. And one of the things I think is the funniest is that he now owns about 20%, allegedly, of an intellectual ventures management company that generates about $10 to $20 million annually in fees. And it's been called a patent troll. So he got on the boat with everybody else.
I'd love to know when the word troll isn't a derogatory term, but that's,
Yeah. And then, by the way, in 2011, this got cleaned up. And what I really think happened is patent trolls, you really have to own the patent. You have to take them to court. There's a huge burden of proof. But when it comes to software licensing, the deck flips the other way. And so really, I think these patent trolls one day were thinking to themselves, I think you found our next business opportunity.
Yeah, it's a better model.
So ironically, what most people do not realize is in a civil copyright infringement claim, the licensee has the burden of proof. They have to show they own the license and they were using it properly. This is a very easy thing to do. Knock, knock, you're being audited. And oh, by the way, you're already guilty till proven innocent. Don, you've been involved with a lot of clients over the years. Do you think the average client understands where their Oracle software or any of the software is running throughout their environment?
I think the average client, particularly those which are EULA clients, have no interest. In fact, would rather think about anything. They'd rather sit in a dentist chair, and a Yankee fan would rather watch them lose to the Red Sox 10-0 than actually even consider what was going on with the proliferation of their licenses within their organization.
I don't know. I think you went a little too far about a Yankee fan actually looking forward to the Red Sox winning. I think you went a
Well, I
little
didn't
too
say that. I was comparing it to the incredibly unpleasant experience of all this innately.
But this is a really important point, though. Software audits, the burden of proof is on the customer. And so, no surprise, Gartner has documented the fact that vendor-imposed and revenue-motivated audits are increasing for organizations of all sizes. And so Microsoft understands this, Oracle understands this, Adobe, IBM. And in fact, you will see in the slide deck, there are links to when we make these statements, the proof point. And so it's becoming easy money.
And it's what I think is really important, Mike, just thinking from the perspective of these mega Silicon Valley companies, their tremendous demand from their boards and from Wall Street to increase their revenue with an ever constricting market for that particular software has led them to this rather nefarious but very effective methodology.
I think you're dead on, right? They're under extreme pressures to generate profits. And in fact, CIO Magazine documented that software audits continue to rise. The usual suspects, Oracle, Adobe, IBM, SAP, 68%. This article came out in August of 2020. Software vendors are increasing license audits. Right? 75% of software vendors believe the software is being overused in violation of the license agreements. Information World made the point, right? In 2021, vendor software license audits become more frequent. Are you prepared? Increases in frequency, more prone to prickly interim conflict, and more amenable to a hurried resolution. And so I really love this picture of Larry because I think it's smug, right?
And I think one of the most important points here is the reason this works is that most of the time they're right. There are many customers out there that have just simply been irresponsible with the way that they have employed the licenses that they legally have. The question is to what degree very often, right, Mike?
I think that's valid. I also think some vendors make it easier to make mistakes by using technology, like not requiring license keys.
Who would do that?
Yeah.
What a silly thing, allowing you to use their incredibly expensive software without even a simple key. I remember when I did my Sybase thesis back in the mid 90s that I had to put in a 25-letter key to even start up a Sybase instance. But nope, there's one company that you don't have to do anything. Right, Mike?
Absolutely. They make it easy. And in fact, recent things showed, people say, well, I'm not going to get audited. Well, in 2018, 75% of small organizations under 1,500 employees, 1 to 3 audits in the past 3 years, up 40%. 40% of large companies report 4 to 10 audits in the past 3 years.
When you least expect it, expect it.
That's so well stated. And so what we're seeing is this trend to have third parties doing audits for the big vendors because it generates revenue. So there was a recent survey that got done, which I really like, in 2021. And what they said is half the respondents audited by Microsoft in the past 3 years. IBM 28%, I'm sorry, Oracle 28%, IBM. So your chance of an audit by Oracle is 1 in 3. Your chance.
And I was really surprised that Microsoft is this far ahead of Oracle, but that's because I'm particularly sensitive about one of those two companies.
Well, I will tell you that Microsoft is a much easier audit process.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And I think they make the rules, to their credit, simpler to understand, and they're not as egregious. but they can get prickly. So you really do have to pay attention. And so the answer is, if you think it's not going to happen to you, then keep your head in the sand, because it will happen to you. And in fact, you see lots, the press has done a good job. And I don't normally say the press has done a good job. We could go on a whole tangent about the press. But what we're seeing is that these strong arm tactics, audits, Oracle uses license auditing model to run audit, bargain, close. Audit you, find a really big number, offer you a bargain, close the business fast. That was the normal Oracle audit book up until recently. And so what the point I try to make here is that the vendor playbooks are constantly evolving. And while audit, bargain, close is a tenet of Oracle's playbook, in looking at Oracle audits, and we also do Microsoft audits at License Fortress, but in looking at Oracle audits particularly, because I use that to frame, they're increasingly reluctant to make modest concessions during the audit process. And historically, that's not been a problem. In the past, when you get notified of an audit, you could say, hey, I'd like to postpone it for a month or two. And now they're really pushing back on such requests. We're seeing them looking for many years of back support. Have you ever, I know, Don, you get involved indirectly through audits. Have you seen Oracle chasing back support in the past?
Yes, I have. And I think it was thought of as a veiled threat before, in terms of trying to bring the customer in an intimidated way to the table to effectively close what is ultimately a sales deal. But I think, as you're saying, Mike, there's an escalation that's going on to this, because A, it works, B, there is a basis to it, and C, a lot of these companies, including Oracle, have they're really stressed about their revenue reporting at the moment, and it's getting more and more so.
I think you just nailed it, to be honest with you. I do think historically it really was a veiled threat. I will tell you now, they're consistently going after back support. And in fact, just to give you a sense of how bad it is, we had a Java audit where they were looking for over 10 years of back support for Java. Does anything hit you ironic about that?
Well, I think that it's coincidental with what has been happening in the Supreme Court over the last 6 months in regards to the battle between it's Mothra versus Godzilla, right? Google versus Oracle. And I will tell you, I've read through these decisions a couple of times, and I'm still not really even sure what the result is.
So I think you're right. It's definitely changing. And so one of the things I commented on was the quasi audit. And so Oracle has an organization called, and I'm not making this up, Software Investment Advisory. It's a team of experts who work with you to maximize the efficiency, value, and impact of your Oracle audit. And in fact, I love Ronald Reagan's comment, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. When SIA approaches you, it looks like an audit duck, it quacks like an audit duck, it's an audit. And so what we would tell you as a best practice is, when somebody approaches you, verify if it's an official audit or not. But understand, when Oracle's asking you questions, or any vendor, treat it seriously, because if you say something, it can come back to haunt you.
So, Mike, you might want to take a second here to define LMS. And I love that little graphic you've got in the middle. Of course, LMS is License Management Service, been around for a long time. They are ostensibly and officially a separate organization inside of Oracle that is a service for license management. In reality, since they have probability of close and a lot of other attributes that a typical sales organization will have, as I was sort of alluding to before, they act in the capacity of an organization that is attempting to close a sale for the account team. So that's the real purpose. And so I think that the industry has learned and now understands that. And so SIA has come into existence.
So you bring up a good point, which is it used to be the rumor mill was that LMS auditors carried a sales quota. And then in Europe, an actual job came out for somebody to join the LMS team in Europe, and it talked about a sales quota. And I kicked myself that I couldn't get a copy of that job description because a proof point is they are a sales organization. So let's hope the IRS does not copy that concept and give them sales commissions based on what they find. And so when an audit happens, you really have to prevent scope creep, because vendors love to go fishing. They love to ask you questions that seem innocent, and that the only reason they're asking those questions is because if you answer them wrong, it expands the scope of the audit. And so the best practice is document the scope of the audit. What are you auditing specifically, right? Only provide the information needed to fulfill your legal obligation. I'll use an example of VMware. Let's say you had a number of VMware clusters and you ran Oracle on one set of clusters and you don't run any Oracle software in the other set of clusters. You are under no obligation to disclose to Oracle the other VMware environment.
In fact, Mike, I think it's given my position at VMware, it's really important for VMware customers, most of you out there, to understand this. And in the context of the scope creep, it's doubly important. You have under no obligation to show, to reveal, to give the credentials for your vCenter application, so that to allow the auditors to go fishing around, to use Mike's words. In fact, I would keep them as far away from that application as humanly possible.
I think you bring a good point up, and really, it's like being on the witness stand. Answer the questions that you're being asked. Don't go get right. Really stick to what your legal obligation is and to the scope of the audit, because you do not want that fishing exercise.
Which brings up another point. If you're on a witness stand, it's really good to have a real professional, meaning a lawyer, who is advising you. And Mike will get to that in a minute.
And so during an audit, we recommend for any vendor have a single point of contact, because really, insert vendor name, will not hesitate to use information gathered from any means to expand the scope of the audit. An employee having drinks with your sales rep can say something that may waive your future rights inadvertently. So the old from World War II, loose lips sink ships. When you have an audit, single point of contact, control the messaging. And in fact, I'd even take it a step further. Stop buying software unless it's critical to the business. Shut everything down till you get through the audit.
I'll add another point to this, and this is going to sound like it's right out of a Hollywood grade B, excuse me, spy movie. Make sure all your employees that have anything to do with Oracle whatsoever are told to not have any outside interaction during that audit with anybody that they might perceive at all to be from Oracle. Don't go on a TikTok or a Tinder date with anybody, because you might that possibly could be involved with Oracle, because you have no idea what they might be saying inadvertently. You have to be very, very careful, and all your employees have to be aware that they just have no place in speaking about any of the details of your present situation. That should be done, as Mike is saying here, from a single channel.
And in fact, at License Fortress, we actually developed a series of position statements with the lawyers, because people need to understand that you can be waiving your rights. This can be very costly to an organization. So I think, Don, your advice is so dead on.
And it's also important to note that in no way are we telling people to not give Oracle the information that they're obligated to, or to lie to them in any way. Just be very professional and very careful about exactly how you go through all this process.
Oh, I think that's so important, right? Because you don't want to violate your rights. You do not want to lie to the vendor. You want to be forthcoming. Right. And in fact, it's funny, we have a position paper, because a lot of times people will say to me, well, I now know I need these licenses. I'll just go buy them and I'll just install them and I won't tell Oracle. No. Once an audit happens, you're under obligation to disclose the information. They have a right to get paid fairly. So yes, I think that is wonderful advice. And so I use the analogy, don't go into a gunfight with a knife, right? A company that represents itself during an audit is a person who's like being their own lawyer and they have a fool for a client. So whether you go to License Fortress or somebody else, get somebody that's familiar with the audit process and have them work with you through the audit, because these playbooks are constantly changing. And in fact, this was an article that came out years ago in General Counsel News, specifically around Oracle. Oracle maintains what I consider the most aggressive audit program. IBM's just as aggressive. Its licensing rules are difficult to understand. They are frequently not clearly stated. And the LMS team is unforgiving when it comes to applying those rules. It uses these ambiguous licensing terms, confusing contracts to prepare audit findings that frankly will frighten the crap out of you. And so I think the cartoon at the bottom says it best. They should have brought a gun.
And I think it's important to note that the basic premises, is which Mike will be going through here in the next few slides, aren't incredibly difficult to understand, but it becomes convoluted almost with intention for the purpose of being confusing and motivating the customer to just simply want to do what they're told and get through it all.
And so we live in a world today of web services, right? On-premise, off-premise. And we had a hard enough time understanding our software licenses when everything was under one roof. Well, this is the world we live in. This is an old slide, but if you look at your organization and you map it, you would have these little dots. You are here everywhere. And so really, it's beyond any organization to properly track it without some sort of software asset management tool and some sort of solution. And so I always pose the question, is your software still in compliance? How do you know? And remember that comment that when you get audited by the vendor, it's your obligation to prove that you were using it correctly. So how do you know? Training. There's a misconception that you have an Oracle unlimited license agreement. Who needs training? Hey, it's unlimited. Well, eventually that ULA goes away. So simple mistakes can be costly. And so we say a best practice is you should give your staff, DBA, system administrators, software license compliance training on a periodic basis, or at least access to a licensed expert.
And in particular with Oracle, the features, those features which are incredibly sophisticated, such as the different levels of partitioning and parallelism and the advanced security, and of course, the biggest of them all, Oracle Real Application Clusters, are really difficult to understand exactly when and how they're used. And Oracle makes it very easy to accidentally use some of them, particularly partitioning, in third-party applications, for example, that you don't realize are maybe using that particular capability. So you've got to be pretty careful when it comes to that. And you can't uninstall those features. They're just there as part of the Oracle RDBMS. So you really want to be careful when you're dealing with this software in general. It's wonderful. It's incredibly sophisticated, but it's also dangerous to you if you're not really being very judicious.
So this is a really important point. If a user downloads software and activates it, your organization is responsible for paying the bill. The cloud is fueled by the ability to easily invoke software application usage. So download it somewhere in your organization, you're responsible for the bill. Click through contracts. I have a contract from Willy Wonka here on the right. I don't know if people remember that famous, child's movie and the fine print. So let me ask the question, how many people, think to yourself in the audience, have just clicked on a contract and accepted it when downloading software?
I think that would be everybody, Mike.
Yeah. And so best practice is read the contract before you accept the terms. It's one of the reasons that License Fortress pre-bake access to legal expertise as part of our solution, so that there's no hesitation to say, hey, we got this downloaded contract, we'd like you to review it. You have to read it. And by the way, there are some vendors, I'm not going to pick on a vendor, it's not Oracle, they don't play this game, but there are vendors now tweaking their downloaded contracts. And then they started about 2 years ago, and now they're coming at people with audits, knowing that based on the terms they made, they're now coming out and going to fail their audits. So there are, just as there are patent trolls or unscrupulous vendors selling software that are tweaking these contracts to get you. It's not just your employees, it's anybody. Systems integrator, MSP, they download it while they're on your site to use it to do something, you pay the bill during an audit. And this is a case in point. You can get this. It's a real case study. There was a major state health exchange. They had a vendor working for them. The vendor created a $15 million liability. We got involved and got it settled for about $5 million. They were pretty happy with that. Had they gotten us before an audit had taken place, they wouldn't have this problem. They did then sue the vendor, which cost them money, for $1 million. So that was a $4 million oops plus legal fees. And then, of course, I like to make the comment that if you were a License Fortress customer we were on the job, and this wouldn't have happened to you. We would have detected it. So that was a small case. This is a really interesting point, which is installing Oracle upgrades. We've seen turn on software features. Then Oracle comes along and audits. I don't think this is, and then tries to charge the customer. I don't think this is intentional by Oracle. I think they're a billion-dollar gorilla. They're a big company, and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. But if the upgrade turns on the feature, you get audited a couple of years ago, and we've seen third-party vendor software do the same thing, you are obligated to pay the bill.
So I think the listener can understand that Oracle has 300 plus separate applications. I mean, just think of the acquisition of NetSuite. NetSuite itself had over 16,000 customers. And when those applications are installed, they do things, as I was referring to before, such as utilize these features sometimes that isn't quite so obvious when the initial install is done. And so when an upgrade occurs sometimes to those applications, the same thing happens. And so I think the point that Mike made about the lack of understanding of the left hand and the right hand sometimes because of the breadth and depth of a company like Oracle is valid. Now, this is where a third-party negotiator with a lot of experience, as I like to use the analogy, if you're going to face major league hitting, you need major league pitching.
Yep.
Can be extremely useful and make your day a lot less stressful.
And so it used to be the recommendation was you should have an annual software asset management, annual software audit. I will tell you today that's not good enough because if you use the software for a month, it's going to be very hard during an audit to mitigate those expenses. So really the best practice is to get a software asset management tool that proactively monitors your environment, software license compliance, because if you can correct the problem in days, hours, or a week or two, odds are we can mitigate the expense to you. And this is the famous Google versus Oracle lawsuit. And who won that lawsuit, Don?
It seemed to me at first that Oracle had won it to the Supreme Court. And then you see the second part of the decision, and it seems to me that Google won it. And I think they both were able to do a lot of damage to each other. To me, Mike, honestly, the final results here as to who really has come out ahead is extremely confusing. And the Supreme Court very intentionally has left some of the real basic questions, such as the bullet point at the bottom of Justice Roberts' suggestion in regards to how APIs can be used, and the analogy that he brought up has been left unsettled at the moment. but I don't really know who won. I think they both sort of won a little and they both lost a lot.
I will tell you that we felt that Oracle was playing nice because they did not want their reputation in the marketplace to taint this case. I can tell you now that that's gone, they're no longer playing nice, and they're coming out with a vengeance that we haven't seen in a very long time. And in fact, one of the things I like to comment on is most companies have no idea how many databases are being deployed. How about Java? Right? When you have Java and you get it from a third-party vendor, who pays for the license? Companies like VMware were very upfront, and they cut a deal with Oracle so that if they use Java, you're covered. But a lot of other vendors left it up to you. And they say to you, oh, by the way, we need Java, and then your employee went and downloaded Java so they could use this application you bought. Well, if they downloaded Java, then you're on the hook for that license.
And of course, there's the free version and there's the actual paid for version, which was the real basis of the Google Android case that lasted over 10 years and went again through multiple Supreme Court decisions. So you have to understand the distinction there, and not many people do.
In fact, my favorite was we had a recent customer, and Oracle's doing a quasi-Java audit, and they're asking for over 10 years of back support. Well, given that they just started charging it for 2019, aren't they glad that we pointed that out to them? They certainly are not entitled to 10 years back support, but they're entitled to at least 2 years back support. And so one of the trends that we see is that the licensing metrics are constantly evolving as vendors try to figure out ways to make more money. And so if you expect your people to be up on all the different license types for Oracle or any other vendor, it's really unfair, because if they're a DBA, they have a full-time job. They don't need to be a license expert.
I love that look, the expression on Harrison Ford's face that is really indicative of the WTF, or you've got to be kidding. You really want me to do that moment.
You're right. And so you've got this goal as a customer trying to save money, and you've got the vendors having policies designed to prevent you from saving money. And they all do it. IBM has the all or nothing subscription. Oracle has the repricing policy, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. SAP has the all or nothing. Microsoft has software assurance. But the goal here is they want to maintain these revenues. And so do you want to walk them through the Oracle repricing policy? Are you familiar with that one? I'd be shocked if you're not.
Well, the idea is that if you have an intention of, or you believe that you're going to be able to retire a certain number of Oracle licenses because you have successfully consolidated, such as with VMware, Oracle reserves the right to reprice their licenses for the remaining, or the support for those licenses for the remaining licenses at present retail value. So it is often the case that even if you are able to successfully consolidate the 23-24% of the license value at a retail level is going to wind up wiping out the savings that you just thought you gained by reducing the number of total licenses. So there's a little bit of arithmetic gymnastics here that, again, you need to professionally examine.
Yeah, you can save money, but it's very tricky.
Yeah.
And so I think you just said it best. And so the net result for most clients, if you don't understand how to do it properly, is that you're going to pay the same amount of money and have less licenses. And so the best practice is do not let procurement consolidate license sets. I've got a huge multinational company right now, and their procurement saying, but we want to consolidate a license sets because it's so difficult dealing with all these different license sets. And what we're trying to explain to them is, yes, but right now, more license sets gives you more flexibility if you ever want to adjust how you're using Oracle up the road.
So I'm from VMware, of course, and one of the very, very early VMware value propositions was the ability to consolidate effectively. And so we don't want you to think that you can't do it or shouldn't do it. But you've got to be very, very careful, and you've got to really think out what your goals are. And again, what the arithmetic is in terms of the real savings in regard to licenses. There are other values to the consolidation too, but you again have to think this out well.
And so overcharging in the software industry is rampant, right? And in fact, I love this quote: we were over licensed and struggling under the burden of high support costs. And people forget the fact that at Oracle support at 25, 30%, you're rebuying your licenses every 3 to 4 years. And so when I make the comment overcharged, in the case of Oracle, you have to understand, or any vendor, the difference between a policy statement versus a contractual obligation. And Gartner Research made the comment: our experience suggests that Oracle is interpreting the policy as if it were a contractual obligation from a pricing and compliance perspective. And so I just want to use this example. Oracle policy cost would have cost you, in this very small example, $1.9 million. Contractual obligation, $380,000. So if you let the LMS rep throw policy at you, you would have just overpaid by a factor of 4. And so the other thing is that Oracle introduced some new policies, and policies can be very good for you, but understand that policy is not a contractual obligation, and they can change their policies at a whim. And more importantly, you can't pick and choose a policy. If you're going to use a policy to your advantage, you got to use the whole thing. You want to comment on the partitioning policy, Don?
Yeah, a couple of things. The note that Mike has highlighted in the slide is very illustrative in the fact of what he just alluded to, in that the policies are not part of a not part of a contract. And very specifically here, the indication is that this particular policy is only for educational purposes. And the more important point, though, is reiterating what Michael said before, that all of the policies are not part of the contract. However, if you choose to adopt those policies and you choose to utilize them and make sort of a separate side agreement with Oracle, you're going to have to be willing to accept all aspects of the policy. But this one's been around for a long, long time, longer than I have. And it really confuses the overall issue of certain VMware capabilities, such as subclustering and so on. And I won't get into it now because we don't have that much time. But License Fortress will be able to do a great job at explaining and actually utilizing those VMware capabilities to make a lot of what's being alluded to in this partitioning policy mute.
And so you really have to understand your contractual obligations. I won't spend a lot of time, but from Oracle perspective, processes will be defined where all processes where the Oracle programs are installed and are running. The other thing is that vendors like to put URL pointers in their contracts these days. And so you better document that link, because here's an example where Oracle stipulates the number of licenses for different servers in the Oracle Processor Core Factor table, a pretty important table, and it was updated 3 times in 2017. Depending on when you struck your contract is the version that you're beholding to. But if you don't have a copy and you don't know that, oops. And so, anything you want to add to that, Don?
No, I think you got that perfectly. Just you have to, it's very, very hard to find out what a link said or what it pointed to at any particular point in time. So when you sign the contract, make sure you've got copies of everything behind those links.
And so just in general, when a software audit happens, halt any intended purposes. This is a really short list. Review your audit and compliance provisions, because just because they're pushing you to do an audit doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it right then and there. Don't let Oracle circumvent the 45-day advance notice requirement. Negotiate the scope. Oracle audit script is not contractual, but that's changing. So if you do run the audit script, there's a way to do it so you don't give up your rights in the future. Limit where the vendor gets the information, right? Part of your training, single point of contact. Get professional help. The audit is about revenue, and don't go into a gunfight with a knife. Anything else you want to add there, Don?
I don't think we have a lot of time left because there's a lot of things that I could add, but as I will go back to the point that I made before, if you're going to face major league hitting, have a major league pitcher, and that's certainly what License Fortress is.
This is a useful guide. The deck is available. It's worth downloading if you're especially an Oracle customer. And we are ending on 12:39. And I know we can spend about 3-4 more minutes if there are any questions.
Hi. We do have one question. When you're talking about negotiating, is there a size limit there in terms of the size of the company to have enough clout to actually negotiate?
So you are asking this question, whoever asked it, at a wonderful time. First of all, this is Oracle end of fiscal year. So I will tell you that they're very willing to negotiate up until about May 15th is about the latest, and then you're really locked in. But one of the things that we do is we have a pricing database. We know by size, by industry, by time of year, what discount you should be getting. We had a healthcare customer. They were getting, I forget, 35% discount. And based on their size, they should have been like a 55% discount.
Mhm.
So really, it's once again, don't go into a gunfight with a knife. You really need to know what should you be getting, right? It's why I hate buying a new car, right? I mean, you really have to do your homework.
Need an agent.
Yeah, do you think?
To buy a car?
Well, I'm trying to buy an RV, and I guarantee you really need an agent.
Okay.
So-
we are pretty much at time here, you two. There is the networking area, so we could go over and continue the conversation there. That's in Feedloop. So Mike and Don would need to get out of Zoom and go over to Feedloop, to the networking area, to continue the conversation. And thanks to both of you. This was great. I always learn so much listening to the two of you banter back and forth. So
We do that.
we appreciate you being here very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.